I
Absolutely.
noticed that people do go back and look at the YouTube videos, so that's kind
Oh,
of
great.
nice too. So
All to the good. All to the good. All right. So,
welcome,
Zach,
Carol. You know the
delighted
deal. Nice to have you back for another month.
to be back. I'm glad to see some of the usual suspects and some new folks as well. Today, on to ancient Egypt. And Zach's got the PowerPoint that he's going to pull up for us. And this is a favorite topic of mine, and I'm guessing maybe a favorite topic of yours too. Something I have worked on for years and years and never ceases to, I think, intrigue and amaze me and make me think more. I personally feel like I can never look at a work of art, something like this piece here, which is actually at the Johnson, 2,000-year-old Egyptian relief, and not think about who these people are. I am so interested in ancient lives, well, and contemporary lives too, but thinking about relationships and the families and the worship and entertainment, and even, yes, thinking, well, who are these people and what did they even eat for dinner and what did they do for entertainment? All those things fascinate me. So today is an attempt to do just that, to give you a little bit of a sense of ancient lives, and in particular, how very, very unusual Egyptian women were in the context of their ancient counterparts. Okay.
We have a hand raised already,
All right.
Jane.
Hand raised. Hand raised. Okay.
You can unmute there. Yep. Okay, there you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I just moved to Ithaca a few months ago. My daughter and her family live here, but I'm from Chicago. And when I was a little girl, and my mother would take my older sister and me into the Field Museum, which is the big natural history museum in Chicago. The entire museum, every time we went, my mother would say, okay, where are we going now? We would say Hall J. And that was the ancient Egyptian hall every time. And she used to say, girls, there's other than Hall J. And we'd say, no, we know that, Mother, but we have to go to Hall J first. And over the years, I've lived in many different cities, and I've always gone to every Egyptian exhibit that's been around. When King Tut came to Chicago in 1977, and then I've been to Egypt several times myself, and I always just loved it. So I've been a very a buff on ancient Egypt, but very, very, I've never really, formally studied it, but it's been a real passion of mine. So I'm very excited for today's.
Good. Well, welcome to Ithaca. As a former Chicagoan, I agree with your passion for the Field Museum and the Open Institute. All right. Well, I'm going to have Zach go on to the next image. We're going to plunge in. So in the 5th century, the Greek historian Herodotus goes to visit Egypt. And for him, this was a bit of I think the best phrase would be a culture shock. He could not believe what he saw because it was so unlike what he was used to. He said the Egyptians themselves, in their manners and customs, seem to have reversed the ordinary practices of mankind, obviously the Greek way. For instance, he says women attend market and are employed in trade, while men stay at home and do the weaving. And again, this seemed to him most peculiar. Unique in the ancient Near East and much of the pre-modern Western world, Egyptian women did stand apart from their Greek counterparts and just about everybody else in the ancient world. Next image, please. In a wonderful book called Pandora's Box, Women in Classical Greece, the writer, who's a curator named Ellen Reeder, tells us a little bit more about this. She said in ancient Athens, women were citizens only for the purposes of marriage, of course, and childbearing. Otherwise, they really didn't have independent status, and you need a male guardian for your entire life. They also were very restricted, and not just to their homes, but also even within the home, the Greek woman was supposed to stay in what were called the women's apartments within the house. Greek reader says, were pretty clear about what they felt was an ideal woman. And these were some of the characteristics, listen to this, that they listed: beautiful voice, intelligent, tall, industrious, well-born, fertile, and that was extremely important to be able to bear heirs, virtuous, modest, passive, submissive, silent, that's important too, and invisible. That was the perfect Greek woman. Next image, please. Now, sadly, the Greeks believed, and this is a wonderful gorgon here in the center of this plate, the Greeks believed that a woman's true nature was just the opposite of what I've just listed. Just to look at the wrong woman, again, like a gorgon, or to listen to the wrong woman, like a siren, was not only dangerous, it was destabilizing to society and, of course, as we know, potentially fatal. Women in Greek society were considered unable to restrain what was believed to be their very natural urges and appetites. There was a wildness really at the heart of them. And should a woman's true nature be unconstrained, or shall we say unshaped or guided by, of course, marriage and motherhood, well, it was just going to be one big disaster for society. Aristotle warned on the subject of women, said the deliberative quality in the soul is present, but not effective at all. But in Egypt, this was a far different story. And I'm going to tell it to you through the life of a hypothetical woman. We're going to make her a late period elite woman, a wife and a mother and a priestess, and we'll even name her Neferet, or beautiful woman. Next image, please. Although certainly not the equals of men, and I don't want to suggest that in any way, shape, or form, it is very fair to say, though, that women play a visible and an active role in Egyptian society, and you can see it everywhere. You can see it in tomb paintings and reliefs and statuary and objects of daily life. And you can read about it in wisdom texts and love poetry too. Next image, please. Women were there side by side with men. You see them in paintings like this. You see them helping with agricultural chores. You see them inspecting estates and helping with cattle counts and watching laborers in the field. And then again, you can see the men always have kind of a brick red skin and always are wearing kilts. The women have these kind of tight, long sheaths. And the women, the convention is the women usually had a kind of a yellowish skin. Next image, please. Next image is a husband and wife working together, again, plowing the fields. The husband ahead with the plow, the wife right behind him, sprinkling the seed. So you'll frequently see these images of real partnership, whether that's partnership in a family or partnership in actually cultivating the land. But it's very, very evident. Next image, please. You'll also see women next to men in these tomb models. And these models were little kind of dioramas. And these dioramas could depict breweries or bakeries or slaughterhouses. And all of these were meant to serve the function of feeding you in the afterlife. So if I brought, a bakery, I would have that bread forever, or a slaughterhouse or a brewery. And in these little workhouses, these work scenes, again, men next to women working away. And again, the convention, women always with the yellowish skin, men with the brick red. And this is a little bakery. I think we can see somebody grinding with like a big mortar and pestle and ovens, and again, side by side work. Next image. Women also shared compulsory state service with men. And it was very clear that women, there were certain careers that were really women's careers. They were, we can see that in this image, they were singers and they were dancers. They were acrobats and weavers. They tended to be the perfumers and the priestesses, nurses, and domestics. Women also specialized in things like arranging your funeral and being professional mourners. There were certain things, though, they clearly were not. You don't see any evidence of a woman being an artisan or a crafts person. There were no women construction workers or brick makers. And interestingly and oddly, women did not deal with laundry. Wouldn't that be interesting? Laundry was seen as men's work, clearly. Interesting. Yeah. Next image, please. What's truly exceptional, though, is, again, our hypothetical woman, our Neferet, was accorded legal rights that would be equal to those of a man of the same social standing, the same class. So needless to say, this had nothing to do with being a poor woman or a lower class woman. This is only about elite women, but it's still pretty fascinating that an elite woman legally is in the same place as an elite man. And also a woman, again, of the same class, had the same expectation of a wonderful, rich afterlife as a male counterpart did. So that's, I think, very unlike the rest of the ancient world, and actually unlike, even the Victorians. At this point, again, elite women could testify in court, could represent themselves legally before a jury. A woman could sit on. A woman could be the executor of an estate, could witness documents, could initiate a civil court case. A woman could inherit and buy and administer and sell property, which is, again, quite shocking. A woman could buy slaves, could free slaves, could make a contract with a wet nurse or a gardener or a merchant. A woman could adopt children and sue for divorce. And oddly and intriguingly, all without a male cosigner. Next image, please. Often a woman was called by the name the mistress of the house. And a woman had certain primary responsibilities, of course, caring for your home, raising a family, and also the food, overseeing food production and textile production. And marriage would have been pretty early, probably about 15 for boys, probably closer to 12 for girls. But again, all of life needed to move at a different pace here, because you can imagine 35 or 40 would have been a pretty darn good, rich life expectancy when you think about some of the things that and the risks that you had to take, particularly in childbirth. And marriages, though, were, for the most part, arranged. And there's still a lot of evidence, even with arranged marriages, of real affection. And there's a lot of love poetry that exists. This is written not from the perspective of a husband to a wife, but this would be something you get from a professional scribe. And I don't know if that would be the equivalent of giving your spouse, a lovely book of poetry or a Hallmark card. But again, you were getting something created by somebody else to pay tribute to a loved one. And these poems really attest to the Egyptian ideals of beauty. And not surprisingly, a woman's beauty was, of course, compared to precious materials. I'm going to read you a sample of surpassing radiance and luminous skin with lovely, clear, gazing eyes. Her lips speak softly. Her neck is long, her breast is white, her hair is true lapis lazuli. Her arm surpasses gold, and her fingers are like lotus buds. Isn't that lovely? What's interesting, too, is in that little bit of love poetry, a woman's beauty is compared to the gods and goddesses. And what's interesting, when you see an Egyptian sarcophagus or a mummy case, you'll see the hair. The hair is always a kind of a rich, dark blue. And the hair of the gods was thought to be made of lapis. The skin of the gods, and remember in this, her arm surpasses gold. The skin of the gods, and you'll see this in sarcophagus, paintings, it was gold. And the bones of the god were thought to be silver. So again, in that bit of love poetry, the woman is so gorgeous that she is compared to a god. Although, as I mentioned, marriages were arranged, the images of husband and wife express a great, great sense of loving support and affection and truly of tenderness. And when you see sculptures like this, see sculptures like this, they have a convention that you can see immediately. And that convention is the man and woman, always the same scale, but there's a loving, just a tender and beautiful little gesture of affection and togetherness that they always have. The man always has his arm back around his wife's waist, and the woman has her hand above the shoulders and resting on the husband's shoulder. So they seem, again, to be really a team and very much depicted artistically as a real unit. Now, the state saw marriage as kind of a private matter. A woman didn't change her name or lose control of her property. And there are these wisdom texts, they're called, the most famous by a writer named Ani, A-N-I, and they have an amazingly contemporary feel to them. Now, let me read one of these. It has a little bit of a, almost an advice column. Ask Amy. Listen to this. Don't boss your wife in her own house when you know she is efficient. Don't keep saying to her, "Where is it? Bring it to me," especially when it is in the place where it ought to be. And those are eternal words of wisdom, I think. Next image, please. Childbirth was very, very difficult and very dangerous. 20% of all pregnancies did not go full term. Another 20% of children didn't make it through their first year of life. So this is a miraculous thing to actually give birth and for the child to live. This goddess named Tauret was an incredibly important figure. Tauret was also called the Great One. And I think you can see we're looking at a pregnant hippopotamus with the back and the tail of a crocodile. The paws are the paws of a lion, but the breasts seem to be pendulous human breasts. So this Tauret figure would be one who would be a protector for pregnant women. So you might have had an amulet of this pregnant hippopotamus goddess, or a little statue or drawing, anything to help protect that pregnant woman or the woman who's just given birth. Tauret was your one. Next image, please. Connected to the worship of Tauret was something called the hippo wand. And the hippo wand was an ivory stick that would be used again to protect that mother and the infant. And this would be used to draw a protective circle around the beds of mothers and infants. Again, anything to do to protect them and to allow the mother to thrive and that child to get to live and to go past year. Please. Daughters and sons were both welcome. And some of the names were fascinating. Some of the names recorded were "Welcome to you." The pretty girl has joined us. And Toph or Toph is powerful. I'm going to go to the next. Huge contrast to Greek society. Let's see, we may be stuck. Oh, there we go. Of course, in Greek society, there are less plentiful food sources, and it's a totally different dowry system. So not all Greek families would have celebrated, or shall we say, welcomed a daughter. Some would have exposed infant girls for the gods to, quote unquote, take into their care. So very, very different world here. Egyptian daughters were welcomed, were not exposed, and both the food sources in the dowry system were such that was just part of this culture, part of this world. You'll also see in tomb paintings and tomb reliefs family scenes. They're usually not big family scenes that we've seen. Often it's a couple of kids. Very rarely, I think about Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti. They had a number of children, I believe 6, and you'll see them with all their kids. But some of the most famous of these scenes usually have 1 or 2 kids involved. This is a very famous hunting scene. Again, the husband front and center, his wife behind him, and his daughter beneath his legs. When you see children, they tend to be depicted as miniature adults, and their scale is just scaled down. You will also see that when you see kids, boys or girls, the convention is that those kids will be naked or minimally clothed. When you see servants, laborers, or kids, that's where they're depicted. Adults are not depicted like that. You'll also see when you see a kid, they've got an unusual hairdo. They have something called a side lock, kind of a side ponytail. And that's what you can see here in the daughter of the central figure, Nebamem, who is again beneath him and holding on to one of his legs. Next image, please. Now, if you had those kids and you were lucky enough to have them, and obviously you could afford it, and again, we're going to make our woman quite elite, Neferet, you could buy toys. And these, of course, would amuse kids, infants. There were rattles that have been found, spinning tops and paddle dolls and hoops and balls. And my favorite are these little carved animals. They have been found in tombs, carved crocodiles and leopards. And this, I love this little hunting dog, this ivory hunting dog. Can you see underneath there's a little stick? And of course you would move and manipulate that stick, and the jaw of the dog would open and shut, which is quite beautiful. And again, board games as well. Senet and Hounds and Jackals were very, very favored games, and those went into tombs as well. Next image, please. After a long day of, say, child rearing and looking after the house and supervising it, our friend Neferet would have maybe wished for a bit of relaxation, entertainment, maybe even a banquet. You might have put on fresh linen. And as I mentioned, there are 2 styles that we see over and over again for several thousand years. One is a tight, form-fitting linen sheath. And you'll see that in many of these images. I don't know quite how you moved in this, but I saw some of the laborers had this tight sheath too. And it must not have fit quite like this glove, but that's the style. The other style you see is a loose flowing gown. And they're both, again, depicted here. Those are the primary garments for women. And for men, it's always the kilt. Next image, please. You could not go out. Our woman couldn't go out without jewelry. Both men and women wore all kinds of jewelry. The most impressive and probably distinctive for Egyptian culture was something called a broad collar. It wasn't just a necklace by any means. It was, again, big, broad, filled with precious materials like gold and carnelian and lapis and turquoise. Those were big. You didn't really have, well, I guess you did have necklaces with maybe an amulet on it, something like an eye of Horus or an ankh, but these were the biggie, the broad collars. There were anklets too, there were bracelets, there were diadems that went around your forehead and then might have had something like a sacred little serpent, fire spinning serpent on it. But those were the big things. I don't think rings were, at least that they've found, that something that were terribly much in evidence. But the broad collar was the Egyptian go-to. Next image, please. Men and women were really fastidious about their personal appearances, and many mirrors have been found. And of course, this is a mirror. You would have looked in this to, of course, gussy yourself up for any kind of event in this life or the next. Frequent bathing was something important. And apparently hairy men were not considered. Do not see beards except in the context of the artificial pharaonic beard that you'll see a pharaoh, and even a female pharaoh will wear that and hook it on. But you don't see men with full beards. Rarely, once in a blue moon, do you see a man with a mustache. Hairy appearance for men was considered both unappealing and, I think I should say, foreign. You know, that's something other cultures do. We don't do that. So you see really clean shaven men most of the time. All kinds of cosmetics. There is nothing that Clinique or L'Oreal was ever concocted that the Egyptians did not think of first. And I believe they had a few things that, again, Clinique has not, figured out how to do either. There were remedies for everything. Next image, please. Of course, every kind of remedy for all kinds of hairdos here. Remedies for gray hair and lack of hair and hair in the wrong places and dandruff, and every kind of lotion and cream and cosmetic you could ever imagine. Formula here is the blood of a black cow boiled in oil, the fat of black snakes, or the contents of ravens' eggs. That would be your hair dye. For hair loss, of course, a big issue, you would simply boil the paw of a female greyhound, a stone of a date, an ass's hoof, and oil, and apply that liberally. And that should just take care of that hair loss. Many elites would shave their heads, and they wore wigs. And the wigs were made of a kind of vegetable fiber with very expensive accessories, high value. And many people took these to the afterlife too, in special wig boxes. So this is a big deal, again, to have a wig, and I'm sure to have a servant clean the wig and keep it in good condition. Next image, please. There were all kinds of perfumes and lotions and creams. Lily was a particularly favorite fragrance. And you would never have even attempted to live in this world or the next world without something called kohl, which is K-O-H-L, which is a combination of an eyeliner and an eyeshadow all in one. And you can see it outlining both for men and for women, outlining their eyes. And it also helped not just to enlarge and beautify the eye, but it also served as, today when you see a football player with a little smear, of grease below their eye, it helped as a form of glare reduction, kind of a sunglasses. Also, the idea was that kohl would catch any little specks of sand and dust before they get in your eye. So this was an all-purpose cosmetic. You tend to see it in black, which is made from gray, sometimes from green, which is from malachite. And you'd never, ever function in this world without that kind of eye makeup. And again, you'd take it with you to the next world too. Next image, please. The most unusual beauty aid, though, that our woman would have had is something you can see here in this banquet scene. And I don't know that I've ever seen it anyplace else. And this is something that is always fascinating when talking about Egypt, and particularly when I do this with schools, you cannot beat. What we're looking at is on top of the heads of both the seated women and the servant who is helping them. And we are looking at a kind of a conical shape edged in yellow. And that is a fatty kind of tallow cone that's laced with fragrance. It was called bit. The idea being that a servant has got a big tray of this fat, and frequently in these tomb paintings, you'll see them topping up somebody's cone. And the concept here, the idea, is that the heat from the top of your head will then melt part of this cone and cover you, I believe, with a sticky, fragrant mess. That would be, I believe, on your, of course it's on your wig. I think it would be on your gown. But I'm sure if you had a cone like this, you had a servant helping to clean that out of your clothing. But that is, I think, something quite unique to this culture. And I don't think I've seen it in other cultures, but that is called bit. And you'll see it on both men and women's heads, but particularly during these very, very elaborate banquet scenes. Next image, please. A banquet, of course, is nothing without food. And an elite woman like Nefret, she would have had access to a rich variety of foods. If you were a regular soul, you would have also been making your own food, but you would have been, brewing your own, fermenting your own beer. making your own bread, maybe getting fish from the Nile, or hunting for ducks. But for the rich, you would have had beef, which would have been, again, a very expensive treat, mutton and goat. More unusual for us, gazelle and antelope. Fish with the Nile were plentiful, and all kinds of fish. Catfish and mullet and perch were faves. Fowl, geese, and duck, I think, are not shocking to us, but perhaps quail, heron, and crane, a little more unusual. Lentils and chickpeas and lettuce and onion and garlic and grapes and figs. The sweetener of choice would have been honey and bread. Everybody survived on bread. And just as today you might think, oh, I'll have some Italian bread, or I'll have some French bread. In the New Kingdom, there were 40 different names for bread. So you can imagine, I don't even know what all the types were, but 40 different names. So bread, really important. Everybody was eating a lot of bread that sadly archaeologists have found had kind of a gritty, sandy texture to it that sadly did wear away the teeth they have found as they have x-rayed mummies. Next image, they didn't have that dental decay, but they had dental attrition. Entertainment would have been a key. In the next image, you're going to see to any banquet, and you would have musicians and dancers that 9 times out of 10, I think they're always women. They have those cosmetic cones. They're playing some kind of a flute, maybe clapping as well, and dancing. And this would have been, again, part of any kind of entertainment. Next image, please. Egyptian women, like our Neferet, would have been very, very involved in the life of temples and worship. And again, for an elite woman, being a priestess would have been something quite doable. Theistic, it's syncretistic. There are many, many gods, but the key gods, of course, are Osiris, depicted here in the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. And right behind him is his sister / wife, Isis, with her magical wings. And the most important female gods, of course, are Isis and Hathor and Mot. And Isis is, she's really the center of everything. Again, she's the wife and the sister to Osiris. Osiris is the embodiment of character and stability and justice and good leadership. And she is the epitome of devotion. He is killed by his jealous brother, who really represents dark forces, and Seth. And just for good measure, he's not just killed, he's dismembered. And he's not just dismembered, but the pieces are thrown all throughout Egypt. Now, this kind of thing does not deter Isis one little bit. She goes to find the pieces. As a wonderful buddy and teacher friend of mine likes to say, she remembers him. She does. She takes the pieces, she puts them back together. She brings them to life with her magical attributes, these wings. And in fact, so successfully does she knit them back together that they conceive a very miraculous child named Horus. And that story of rebirth, of resurrection, is central, of course, to the Egyptian belief in the afterlife. Everybody wants to do the same thing. Model of this. So Isis is the first wife and the first mother, and as such, really important figure. Next image, please. She is practical and robust and devoted and loyal and determined and diligent. And she is right there at his side. She is daughter, sister, wife, and mother. And she is the image of a woman as a protector and a nurturer. So what I really love, and again, this is fascinating, Isis is both a restorer of life to Osiris, and she's a giver of life to her child, to Horus. So it's interesting to compare her to other cultures and other beliefs, because narratives we may know in other religions, she's a vessel for a miraculous birth. a very miraculous birth. And she's also, this is intriguing, she's the one doing the resurrecting. So she's a very, very intriguing character. And you'll see her on tomb paintings. She's right there on your sarcophagus. She's just central to belief here. Next image, please. Lots of the roles women played in religious life were an outgrowth of this whole cult of Isis, because Isis was the first mourner as Osiris is killed for the first time. And she paves the way for women to, work arranging funerals and to do something, which is a career, to be a professional mourner. So you would hire professionals to come to that funeral procession, and they would wail and weep and tear at their hair and emote. They also, as I said, could arrange your funeral or be a mortuary assistant that might, I might help with the upkeep of a tomb and its offerings. Next image, please. Or again, I could be a priestess, and this is only for elite women, of course. I could be a priestess in a temple or a temple singer, kind of like a choir that would work at a temple. That was, again, a musician would have been a common occupation for elite women. And I would have had either clapsticks, or this is called a menat, which is a beaded necklace that you would shake. But the music and the singing was really an important part of a priestess's job. Next image, please. If our friend Neferet had been married and had been really lucky enough to successfully give birth to 2 children, and they had lived past their first year, she'd be doing great. And again, if she got to 35 or 40, I would say this was pretty miraculous. But in many ways, her death would have simply been an interruption. If she had the right needs met, and all of these needs, of course, required resources, money, and that you could have a great afterlife too. And the needs, of course, were preserving the body through mummification, preserving your name through hieroglyphs, little worker figurines called shabtis, food and drink, and the Book of the Dead, the Book of Spells. Next image. So after a very, very expensive and time-consuming embalming process, often up to 3 months, our woman, Neferet, she would have been ready. She would have been ready to kind of prepare herself for this afterlife by bringing everything that was important to her, including, again, images of herself and loved ones. Next image, she has got to bring food. She's got to bring images of food and actual food and models of food with her. Next image, she's got to bring, of course, you don't want to be stuck anywhere without transportation. Some people brought chariots. Many brought boats, little wooden boats, 2 of them. You'd want a boat with a sail and a boat without a sail. So I could go in both directions on the Nile. Next image, please. You bring all of your toiletries, your jewelry, your makeup, your wig box, all of that, your, pastimes, your board games. Next image, you wouldn't want to be caught in the next life without music either. A famous image of the blind harpist. People also brought images of musicians with them. And the next image, and if you had all of that packed and ready to go, that would be, again, part of a very, very elaborate funeral procession. And here you can see some of the offerings being carried, the professional mourners. People have jars with them and worker figurines. And at the very, very far right is the mummy going through a process with priests that would eventually animate the mummy and everything you brought with you so that you would be there to serve you in the next life. Next, and I believe the final image, with all that preparation done, we see a seated Osiris here, the Lord of the underworld. With all that preparation done, Neferet would be ready to meet Osiris, the Lord of the underworld, and then begin, with all of that done, this rich afterlife, surrounded by images of your loved ones and your favorite belongings and your favorite pastimes. And this afterlife would, of course, be very, very much like the life that she just left. So I thank you so much for joining me this morning with a little look at ancient Egypt. I'm happy to try to answer any questions. I may not have the answers, but I'm happy to try. I hope this has sparked some interest.
Thank you, Carol, for your presentation.
My pleasure. My pleasure. You can't
Yes.
with ancient Egypt. It's never ceases to fascinate.
Right, right. So I have a couple of questions, but I'll just try to limit it. What is the date of, or the date range of the exhibits that you've shown us? How did the Johnson acquire them? How was collection gotten? And how do you restore and preserve some of these ancient works, particularly the paintings with the dyes? I assume they're natural dyes, maybe some of the stoneworks and the ivory. So how do you preserve them?
Well, great questions. The Johnson, actually, in these virtual talks, I've used things from all over. The Johnson has very, very little. The Johnson has the very first piece that I showed you, which is the tomb relief. The Johnson has that. The Johnson has a wonderful worker figurine. It has a coal pot or a makeup pot. Those are on display on the second floor. It has in storage many, many little bronzes. And they're bronzes of Osiris and Isis and Horus and various gods. Those aren't on display, but they might come out, for a college class or something like that. So I would have to say right away, our collections are very, very tiny. At the Department of Anthropology, which is just across the way from the Johnson, they have a sarcophagus that is in not good condition. They have other materials, but those don't belong to the Johnson. They belong to the Department of Anthropology. So we have very, very little. In terms of conservation, what I showed you were things at other collections and other museums. The best collections in the country are, as your Jane brought up, the Field Museum in Chicago, the Metropolitan Museum of New York, the Oriental Institute in Chicago have huge and extensive and elaborate collections and conservation departments. I would guess, and I don't know if they're having these conversations, that some of these museums might be being asked to return things and repatriate them. That could be, I don't know. Most museums are going through a process now of provenance. So you have to say, well, where did it come from? How did it get here? Is it supposed to be here? So they've done that for things like the Native American graves, repatriation. They've done it for World War II era things, and they've done that for ancient objects. So I'm guessing in many museums, there are those conversations of saying, all right, how did this come? And can it belong here or not?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, and I was asking about the age. Do you have some idea of the range, the date range? Because when I see the one, I don't know if it was a stone or a stone carving or a painting where they were having bread, I thought, my gosh, that's really advanced. That's something advanced. So, there would have to be fire or a stove or something like that. So what's the age of most of these collections?
And this is a huge span, so you've got Old and Middle and New Kingdom. So you've got about 3,000 years of history. So for the New Kingdom person, and that's, just about the time of the Romans, they're looking back at the Old Kingdom, and that's ancient history for them. They would go to a tourist attraction to see a pyramid. If I was a New Kingdom person, that's an interesting ancient thing. So this is such a huge, long, continuous sweep of history. So we go all the way again from the Old Kingdom to, this period where you're in the Roman world. So, Cleopatra is like practically modern compared to the earliest things that you see. The first thing I showed you is 2,200 years old, the first relief. But it's a huge span of history. And I guess what I find fascinating is, again, that New Kingdom person would have thought, well, let's go see some ancient history. And they would have gone to a pyramid. And there are New Kingdom Egyptians who went to old sites and, put the graffiti on them. So it's just such a long, shockingly long period of time. that again, I would just recommend. There's so many good books, but the most fascinating, I think one of the best biographies I've read in many, many years is Cleopatra by Stacy Schiff. If you haven't read that, it is a page turner. You cannot put it down. I grabbed a copy at the last library sale, and then I passed it on to another buddy. She talks about what we know and what we don't know, and it is just thrilling and exciting. And again, that's very, very, very late. And as she actually said, Cleopatra was about as Egyptian as Elizabeth Taylor. Yeah, it's just a fascinating, fascinating book. And she is a wonderful, rich, vibrant writer, that Stacy Schiff. If you haven't read her, look at that book.
How do you spell her last name?
Well, let me just Google it. I don't know if it's SCH. Let me just look. And it was about a few years ago. Okay, I'm not getting anywhere. I don't know if anybody else read it. Yeah, I can barely. This is like, I'm not getting anywhere. It's just called Cleopatra. I'm sorry, my phone is not going anywhere. Let me try again.
I found it. It's SCHIFF.
Okay. All right. So I would
Just like Adam.
highly recommend that book, because I just thought I learned so much, and I thought it was absolutely wonderful. Oh, it's from 2010, so this is pretty old, but very, very good. There are a lot of great catalogs from museums too, but I just thought that was just a wonderful recent book. Okay.
So I was just wondering, it sounds like, there was an infant mortality rate of almost 40%. I was just wondering about maternal mortality rate.
I don't know that. It had to be huge. It had to be, and that's a great question, but I don't know. I don't know. And I just can't imagine. It's fascinating when you see these images. Again, very rarely do you see a big old family. You just don't. The only one I can think of is Nefertiti and Akhenaten, and how unusual. I believe they had 6 daughters, which I thought just to be able to bear 6 kids, but successfully, that seems pretty unusual. But as a pharaoh's wife, I'm sure she had the top med school training of the day. But again, I can't even imagine what this looks like. There were Egyptian doctors and physicians. Medical tools have been found. But what's fascinating is that, of course, the religious and the medical and the magic were all of a piece. So if I'd broken my leg, I wouldn't just get the splint, because that wasn't going to help. I would get the splint and the amulet and the magical ointment, and I'd go to the temple, and because the religious and the medical were so closely entwined. It wasn't going to help if I just got the splint. It just wasn't. So that's another fascinating thing, just seeing how they're all the pieces are entwined. There's a couple of good books at Cornell. One was just Women in the Ancient World. That was a catalog. I think it's called Mistress of the House, and I'm pretty sure I got that from the Fine Arts Library. But there are a number of books just on women in the ancient world, or in the ancient Egypt. And that Pandora's Box book by Ellen Reeder was just fascinating, because again, I don't think I'd realized how different the Greek woman's position was. And just, I thought it was fascinating, the concept that, again, if unrestrained, a Greek woman, just needs training and restraint to successfully be in society. And I thought that's just a fascinating idea. And that often the Greek woman was associated with certain wild animals, frequently things like bears. They're like, well, that's just her nature. I don't know. I just think it's fascinating. But that's another good book. And I'm pretty sure that's at the Cornell Library too. It's just called Pandora's Box, Women in Classical Greece. and that is Ellen Reeder, Reeder.
Thank you.
I have another preservation restoration question. I'm struck by like the necklaces, how intricate and hundreds of beads and so on. When those are found, are they intact? Do they have such good thread that lasted all that time?
That's a great question. I can't imagine that they would be. I would imagine again, and in some other burial images I've seen where, you know, the piece is laid out and you realize, oh, the connecting element isn't there, but it's laid out. So I'm imagining that most of those have to be the thread or the wire has to be restrung and reconnected. As I say, we don't have an objects conservator at the museum. We don't have a conservator at all. If we have a paper piece, that goes to a conservator who works through the Cornell libraries, and then paintings go off, I believe, to Williams. But I'm sure, you know, a big museum like the Met or in Chicago, they would have a huge conservation department with people. Some people specialize in paintings, some in paper, some in objects. So an objects conservator would have to look at those and see what's required.
Is Johnson open?
I wish, Melissa. Johnson is right here in my dining room. Right now, I think the understanding, and you all know with the students, the idea is the students will come back for virtual 2 weeks with heavy testing. And then I hope we would open at the beginning of February. But I really don't, I think it's a day by day excitement and adventure.
Yep. Thank you.
Right, all right. Anybody else?
Any final questions for Carol here? Well, thank you again, Carol. Another fascinating talk, and we really appreciate you making the time for us.
Well, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me. One of these days, it'll be in the real world. Let us hope. We'll get out of the dining room.
For sure.
Zach, at least go to the living room. Maybe. All right. Take care, all. All righty.
Thank you. Good to see you.
See you next
Thank
month.
you.